The secure teletype message from Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's headquarters in the west arrived at the Wolf's Lair in the early morning hours of December 17, 1943, carrying information that would force Adolf Hitler to confront a reality he had been attempting to deny through ideological conviction and wishful thinking. General Dwight D. Eisenhower had been appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force that would direct the anticipated invasion of Western Europe, giving him command authority over British, American, Canadian, and other Allied forces that would be assembled for the cross-channel assault, and placing operational control of the coming campaign in the hands of an American general whose professional competence Hitler had dismissed, but whose appointment signaled that the United States would be the dominant partner in the Western alliance, and that American strategic priorities and American military power would determine how the invasion would be conducted. Hitler received this news with reactions that revealed the complex and contradictory strategic thinking that characterized his approach to the war's Western theater. There was continued contempt for American military capabilities rooted in racial theories about mongrel democracy's inability to produce effective martial leadership. There was concern about what American industrial might and organizational capacity might mean when applied systematically to invasion planning and execution. But there was also a peculiar sense of opportunity stemming from Hitler's conviction that concentration of Allied command under a single American general might create coordination problems that German forces could exploit, and that Eisenhower's appointment might signal Anglo-American tensions that could be leveraged to fracture the Allied coalition before the invasion was launched. Though events would prove that Hitler's assessment of Eisenhower and of what American command of the Western Front would mean was yet another catastrophic misjudgment based on ideological assumptions rather than on realistic evaluation of enemy capabilities and intentions. Hitler's initial response to learning that Eisenhower would command Allied forces in the coming invasion reflected the Führer's persistent underestimation of American military capabilities and his inability to accept that democratic societies could produce military excellence comparable to what Nazi ideology insisted was the unique product of authoritarian systems led by superior racial ideological warriors. The intelligence reports about Eisenhower's background and career that German military intelligence had compiled painted a picture of professional American officer who had risen through staff positions rather than through combat command, who had coordinated rather than led forces in North Africa and Italy, and who represented the kind of organizational and political general that Hitler associated with democratic armies, where promotion depended on bureaucratic skills rather than on battlefield brilliance. This assessment was fundamentally flawed in ways that would become apparent when Eisenhower's management of the Normandy invasion and subsequent campaign demonstrated operational competence and strategic judgment that German forces could not counter with available resources. But Hitler's ideological framework prevented him from recognizing that coalition warfare required exactly the kind of coordinating and diplomatic capabilities that Eisenhower possessed, and that American military culture's emphasis on staff work and systematic planning created operational effectiveness that could overcome the kind of tactical brilliance that individual German commanders might display. The detailed intelligence that German military intelligence services had compiled about Eisenhower's career trajectory revealed a professional officer who had spent most of his military life in staff and training positions rather than in command of combat units, who had not seen combat in World War I, despite serving in the army during that conflict, and whose rise to supreme command had been meteoric and based primarily on his demonstrated abilities in planning and coordination, rather than on battlefield victories that would have made him famous to German military observers. This profile reinforced Hitler's preconceptions about American military leadership. He saw Eisenhower as typical product of democratic system that valued political skills and bureaucratic competence over the warrior ethos and combat experience that Nazi ideology emphasized as essential for military leadership. The fact that Eisenhower had never personally led troops in battle became, in Hitler's assessment, evidence that he would lack the battlefield instincts and aggressive spirit necessary for successful military command. But this analysis completely missed what coalition warfare actually required and what Eisenhower's particular skills would mean for the success of the Allied invasion. The challenge facing Allied forces in 1944 was not primarily tactical. Individual units and commanders on both sides possessed tactical competence and could fight effectively in various combat situations. The challenge was operational and strategic. How to coordinate forces from multiple nations with different military cultures and strategic priorities, how to plan and execute the most complex amphibious operation in history, how to maintain political cohesion among allies whose interests did not always align, and how to sustain offensive operations across distances and against opposition that would test logistical systems and organizational structures. These challenges required exactly the skills that Eisenhower possessed: the ability to manage complex organizations, to coordinate among different national military establishments, to maintain political support for military operations, and to think systematically about how to apply superior resources to achieve strategic objectives. The broader context of Eisenhower's appointment involved the strategic debates within the Allied coalition about who would command the invasion force and how operational authority would be distributed between American and British commanders who had different strategic priorities and different assessments of how the invasion should be conducted. The British, led by Winston Churchill and by senior military commanders who had been fighting Germany since 1939, had argued for approaches emphasizing peripheral operations in the Mediterranean and Balkans that would exploit what they saw as Germany's southern vulnerabilities while avoiding the kind of direct assault against fortified positions that had characterized Western Front operations in World War I, and that the British remembered as catastrophically costly in lives. The Americans, led by President Franklin Roosevelt and by General George Marshall, who served as Army Chief of Staff, had argued for direct approach across the English Channel into France that would establish Second Front, engaging major German forces and creating conditions for decisive campaign that would drive toward Germany itself and achieve complete Nazi defeat through sustained offensive operations. The debates between British and American strategic planners had been ongoing since the United States entered the war, and they reflected genuine differences in strategic culture, in assessment of German vulnerabilities, and in willingness to accept casualties in pursuit of military objectives. The British approach, shaped by the experience of World War I, and by the knowledge that Britain's manpower resources were limited and that British casualties could not be easily replaced, emphasized economy of force and achieving objectives through indirect approaches that would minimize casualties while exploiting enemy weaknesses. The American approach, reflecting a nation with vast population and industrial resources and a military culture that emphasized decisive engagement and rapid conclusion of conflicts, favored direct assault and sustained offensive operations that would destroy enemy forces and achieve complete victory, even at significant cost in casualties. Eisenhower's appointment as Supreme Commander represented American strategic vision prevailing in these debates and signaled that the invasion would be conducted according to American preferences for direct assault, for concentration of maximum force at decisive point, and for sustained offensive operations aimed at destroying German military power rather than at achieving limited objectives through peripheral campaigns. Hitler's intelligence about these strategic debates led him to believe that Anglo-American tensions might be exploited, that British reluctance about cross-channel invasion might create opportunities for driving wedges between the Allies, and that concentrating command under an American general might alienate British commanders and create coordination problems that German defenses could exploit. These assessments, like so many of Hitler's strategic judgments about the Western Allies, were based more on what he wanted to be true than on what evidence actually demonstrated. The reality was that Allied command relationships, while not without tensions, functioned effectively enough to plan and execute the most complex amphibious operation in military history and to sustain coordinated offensive operations across Western Europe despite the challenges of managing coalition forces with different national interests and military cultures. The intelligence available to German command about Eisenhower's previous operations in North Africa and Italy should have provided more realistic assessment of what his command of the invasion force would mean for German defensive planning. Eisenhower had coordinated the torch landings in November 1942 that brought American forces into North Africa, had managed the complex coalition that drove Axis forces from Tunisia by May 1943, had directed the Sicily invasion in July 1943, and had overseen the Italian campaign that had tied down substantial German forces in defensive operations that consumed resources needed elsewhere. Each of these operations had demonstrated Eisenhower's capabilities in managing coalition warfare, in coordinating complex operations involving multiple services and nationalities, and in maintaining political cohesion among allies whose strategic priorities did not always align perfectly. The torch landings in particular had demonstrated capabilities that should have worried German planners more than they apparently did. The operation involved simultaneous landings at multiple points across French North Africa, required coordination between American and British forces operating from bases thousands of kilometers apart, achieved tactical surprise despite the massive scale of preparations, and established Allied forces in theatre where they would progressively expand operations and eventually eliminate all Axis forces. The success of Torch demonstrated that Allied forces could conduct complex amphibious operations, could coordinate operations across vast distances, and could sustain forces in theatres far from their home bases, all capabilities that would be essential for successful cross-channel invasion, and all capabilities that German assessments tended to dismiss as products of fortunate circumstances or weak opposition, rather than as indicators of genuine Allied operational competence. The success of these operations should have warned German planners that Eisenhower's appointment meant the invasion would be professionally planned and competently executed, but Hitler's framework for assessing military leadership emphasized individual battlefield brilliance over organizational competence and diplomatic skill, leading him to dismiss Eisenhower as staff officer rather than combat commander, and to underestimate what systematic American planning and overwhelming material superiority would mean when applied to invasion of France. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who had been appointed to command Army Group B, and who was responsible for defending the Atlantic Wall against the anticipated invasion, understood more clearly than Hitler that Eisenhower's appointment and the resources being assembled in Britain for the invasion represented serious threat that would require Germany's best efforts and maximum resource commitment to counter effectively. Rommel had fought against American forces in North Africa and had witnessed firsthand how American military capabilities evolved through combat experience, how American material advantages translated into operational effectiveness, and how American institutional culture's emphasis on learning and adaptation created forces that improved continuously and that eventually overcame German tactical advantages through systematic application of superior resources and through progressive development of operational competence. Rommel's experience with American forces had shown him that early American mistakes and tactical errors, the kind that German forces had exploited at Kasserine Pass and in other early engagements, were rapidly corrected through institutional learning processes that incorporated battlefield lessons into training and doctrine with speed that exceeded what European military establishments typically achieved. The American forces that Rommel faced in Tunisia in early 1943 were far more capable than the forces that had first landed in North Africa in November 1942, demonstrating that American military organizations could learn and adapt rapidly when given combat experience and when supported by the kind of resources that American industrial capacity made available. Rommel's assessments to Hitler throughout early 1944 emphasized that defending against the invasion would require positioning armored reserves close to likely landing beaches where they could counterattack before Allied forces established secure beachheads, would require completing Atlantic Wall fortifications that remained inadequate in many sectors, and would require concentrating maximum German combat power in the West, rather than maintaining the dispersed deployments that had German forces committed to multiple theaters where they could not achieve decisive results in any single sector. But Rommel's arguments for concentrating resources in the West and for positioning reserves to enable immediate counterattacks against invasion forces clashed with competing priorities and with strategic assessments that reflected Hitler's continued focus on the Eastern Front as the decisive theater, and his conviction that the Atlantic Wall's fortifications, combined with German tactical superiority, would enable defeat of invasion forces at acceptable cost, without requiring the kind of massive resource commitment that Rommel advocated. The debate between Rommel and Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt about defensive strategy revealed fundamental disagreements about how to respond to invasion, and about what German forces could realistically accomplish against the Allied forces that Eisenhower would command. Rommel argued for defeating the invasion on the beaches through immediate counterattacks by armor positioned close to the coast, recognizing that Allied air superiority would make movement of reserves from interior positions extremely difficult once invasion began, and that the crucial period would be the first hours and days when Allied beachheads were most vulnerable. Von Rundstedt advocated a more traditional approach of holding armor in central reserves that could respond to the main Allied effort once invasion location was identified, following German doctrine that emphasized mobile defense and powerful counterattacks rather than rigid forward defense that might result in forces being committed piecemeal to sectors that proved to be diversionary rather than the main Allied landing. This strategic debate was never satisfactorily resolved, partly because both approaches had merit within different assumptions about Allied capabilities and about German resources, and partly because Hitler's command style involved making decisions that split differences rather than choosing clearly between alternative approaches. The result was command structure that combined elements of both strategies in ways that satisfied the logic of neither. Some forces were positioned forward where they might contest landings directly. Others were held in reserve where they might respond to identified main effort. But the division of authority and the requirement for Hitler's personal approval for committing the most powerful reserves ensured that neither approach could be fully implemented when the invasion actually occurred. Hitler's decision to split the difference between these approaches, positioning some forces forward under Rommel's control, holding others in reserve under von Rundstedt's authority, but keeping the most powerful panzer divisions under his personal control, requiring his explicit authorization for their commitment, created command structure that satisfied neither marshal and that would prove disastrous when the invasion occurred. The system ensured that when D-Day came, the armored reserves that might have counterattacked effectively were held immobile, while headquarters tried to determine whether Normandy was the main Allied effort or a diversion, and while staff officers hesitated to wake Hitler with requests for authorization to commit reserves, losing crucial hours when rapid response might have prevented Allied consolidation of beachheads. The preparations for invasion that Allied forces conducted throughout late 1943 and early 1944 demonstrated the scale of resources and the thoroughness of planning that Eisenhower's command brought to the operation, and German intelligence documented much of this preparation through reconnaissance, through monitoring Allied communications, and through reports from agents and collaborators in Britain and in occupied France. The intelligence painted picture of massive force assembly involving millions of soldiers, thousands of ships and landing craft, vast quantities of equipment and supplies, and training exercises that suggested Allied forces were developing sophisticated capabilities for amphibious operations. The scale of the build-up was undeniable. Ports throughout southern England were filled with invasion craft. Training areas were occupied by forces practicing amphibious assaults, and the accumulation of supplies and equipment created concentrations that were visible to aerial reconnaissance and that clearly indicated major operations were being prepared. But this intelligence was filtered through analytical frameworks shaped by assumptions about American incompetence and about inevitable coordination problems in coalition operations, leading German assessments to emphasize potential Allied weaknesses rather than to acknowledge that the force being assembled represented combination of American industrial might, British experience, and systematic planning that would create invasion capability far exceeding what Germany could effectively counter with available resources. The tendency to see what ideology predicted rather than what evidence demonstrated shaped German intelligence assessment throughout this period, creating a situation where accurate information about Allied preparations was available, but was interpreted through frameworks that prevented realistic evaluation of what that information meant for German defensive planning. The deception operations that Allied forces conducted to mislead German intelligence about invasion timing and location exploited Hitler's preconceptions and his tendency to see what his strategic assumptions predicted rather than what evidence demonstrated. Operation Bodyguard and its various subsidiary operations created false impressions about Allied force dispositions, suggested that invasion might target Norway or Pas-de-Calais, or multiple locations simultaneously, and reinforced German expectations that the main invasion would strike across the narrowest part of the English Channel toward Pas-de-Calais, where the distance was shortest and where German defenses were strongest. The Phantom 1st U.S. Army Group, supposedly commanded by General George Patton and concentrated in southeastern England opposite Pas-de-Calais, became focus of German intelligence assessment, with reports about this non-existent formation shaping German defensive planning in ways that positioned substantial forces to defend against invasion that would never come, while the actual invasion forces assembled for Normandy with greater security and achieved tactical surprise despite the massive scale of the operation. The success of these deception operations revealed both the sophistication of Allied intelligence and security operations, and the vulnerabilities created by German analytical frameworks that interpreted information through ideological lenses rather than through objective assessment. The Phantom Army Group was made believable through combination of false radio traffic, dummy equipment visible to aerial reconnaissance, and carefully managed information fed through double agents whom Germans believed were reliable sources. But the deception succeeded primarily because it aligned with what German planners expected and wanted to believe: that Patton would command the main invasion force, that the invasion would strike at the obvious location across the shortest water crossing, and that Allied forces would follow predictable logic in planning their operations. Hitler's response to intelligence about Allied invasion preparations mixed several contradictory impulses that revealed his inability to develop coherent defensive strategy for the Western Front. He insisted that the Atlantic Wall must be held at all costs and that every beach must be defended. Yet he could not provide the resources necessary for completing fortifications that remained inadequate in many sectors, or for positioning forces sufficient to defend the entire coastline effectively. He emphasized the importance of defeating the invasion at the beaches before Allied forces could establish secure lodgements. Yet he maintained command structure that prevented rapid commitment of reserves necessary for immediate counterattacks. He predicted that Allied forces would suffer catastrophic casualties attempting to assault prepared defenses. Yet he could not explain how German forces would prevent Allied consolidation once beachheads were established, or how Germany would sustain defensive operations against enemies possessing overwhelming superiority in material and inability to replace losses. The gap between Hitler's strategic pronouncements about defending the West and the actual resources allocated to that defense revealed the fundamental problem facing German strategy in 1944. Germany was fighting a multi-front war that required defending simultaneously against Soviet offensives in the east, against Allied advances in Italy, against strategic bombing that was devastating German cities and industrial capacity, and against the anticipated invasion in the west, yet German resources were insufficient to defend adequately against all these threats simultaneously. The choice between concentrating forces in one theatre at the expense of others or dispersing forces across all theatres in ways that made them inadequate everywhere was a choice that Hitler could not or would not make clearly, resulting in compromises that left Germany vulnerable on all fronts. The D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944, validated Allied planning and demonstrated what Eisenhower's command could accomplish when American resources and organizational capacity were systematically applied to complex military operation, requiring coordination of naval, air, and ground forces across multiple beaches and involving forces from multiple nations operating under unified command structure. The landings achieved tactical surprise, despite German awareness that invasion was imminent, established beachheads at all 5 assault beaches, despite varying levels of resistance and despite German defensive preparations, and began the build-up of forces and supplies that would enable sustained offensive operations aimed at liberating France and driving toward Germany itself. The operation was not flawless. Casualties at Omaha Beach were higher than planned. Some objectives were not achieved on the first day, and the campaign that followed involved hard fighting and slower progress than optimistic planning had anticipated. But the fundamental success of establishing Allied forces in France against German opposition represented vindication of Eisenhower's planning and demonstration of Allied capabilities that German assessments had dismissed as impossible for democratic armies to achieve. The scale and complexity of D-Day exceeded anything that had been attempted previously in amphibious warfare, involving over 150,000 troops landing on the first day, supported by thousands of ships and aircraft, with logistics systems that could sustain forces and deliver reinforcements faster than German forces could respond. The coordination required to execute such an operation, synchronizing naval bombardment with airstrikes and ground assaults, managing traffic through limited beach exits, maintaining communications among forces spread across dozens of kilometers of coastline, demonstrated organizational capabilities that reflected the systematic planning and professional competence that Eisenhower's command brought to the operation. Hitler's response to the Normandy landings revealed his continued inability to accept what Allied success meant for German strategic position and his tendency to interpret events through ideological frameworks that prevented realistic assessment. He insisted that Normandy was a diversion and that the main invasion would still come at Pas-de-Calais, leading to decisions that held substantial German forces away from the actual battle defending against invasion that never came. He ordered counterattacks by forces that lacked the strength to achieve objectives, demanded that positions be held when mobile defense might have been more effective, and refused to authorize withdrawals that might have preserved forces for defense of more critical terrain. Most fundamentally, he could not acknowledge that Eisenhower's command had demonstrated capabilities that made Allied victory in France increasingly likely, and that German forces in the West faced enemies whose resources and operational competence exceeded German ability to counter effectively with available means. The Normandy campaign that followed the initial landings demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of Allied operations under Eisenhower's command and revealed patterns that would characterize fighting in Western Europe through to Germany's final defeat. Allied forces possessed overwhelming material advantages that allowed them to sustain operations despite heavy casualties and despite tactical setbacks, could replace losses in men and equipment far faster than German forces could, and could employ firepower in quantities that overwhelmed German defensive positions. But Allied forces also faced determined German resistance that exploited defensive advantages of Norman bocage terrain. that demonstrated the tactical competence that remained characteristic of Wehrmacht even in defensive operations, and that imposed delays and casualties that exceeded optimistic Allied planning assumptions. The breakout from Normandy in late July and early August, achieved through Operation Cobra and exploited by Patton's Third Army racing across France, demonstrated what Allied forces under Eisenhower's coordination could accomplish once German defensive lines were broken, and once the operational mobility that American armor and logistics enabled could be fully employed. The advance across France in August liberated Paris, drove German forces back toward the German border, and created a strategic situation where Germany now defended on two major fronts, while also facing Allied advances in Italy and progressive Soviet offensives in the east that were destroying German forces faster than replacements could be provided. The speed of the Allied advance exceeded German ability to establish new defensive positions, created situations where entire German formations were encircled and destroyed, and demonstrated that once Allied forces achieved operational mobility, German forces lacked the resources to prevent progressive retreat toward Germany's borders. Field Marshal Walter Model, who replaced von Kluge as commander in the West after the latter's suicide, inherited a situation where German forces were in full retreat, where coherent defensive lines had dissolved, and where preventing complete collapse required skills and resources that Germany could no longer provide. Model's reports to Hitler throughout late August and September documented the impossibility of stabilizing the Western Front without substantial reinforcements, without adequate supplies of fuel and ammunition, and without the air support that Allied superiority had made impossible for German forces to receive. But Model also recognized what von Kluge and Rommel had understood before him, that Eisenhower's command of Allied forces meant Germany faced enemies who could coordinate operations across vast fronts, who could concentrate overwhelming force at decisive points, and who possessed the logistical capacity to sustain operations at pace that German forces could not match. Model's assessment emphasized that German forces in the West retained tactical competence and could fight effectively in defensive operations when provided with adequate resources and when allowed to employ mobile defense rather than being required to hold fixed positions regardless of cost. But he also recognized that tactical competence could not overcome strategic disadvantages in force ratios, in logistics, and in air support, and that without fundamental changes in resource allocation or strategic priorities, German forces in the West would progressively retreat under Allied pressure until they reached Germany's borders and eventually until Allied forces occupied German territory itself. The failure of Operation Market Garden in September, the Allied airborne operation aimed at seizing bridges in Holland and creating route into northern Germany, provided temporary respite for German forces and created a brief period when Hitler could claim that Allied overextension and coordination problems had created opportunity for German counteraction. But the reality was that Market Garden failed primarily due to factors specific to that operation rather than due to fundamental Allied weaknesses, and the failure did not alter the broader trajectory of Allied advances or the fundamental imbalance in resources and capabilities that made German defeat in the West increasingly inevitable as Allied forces approached German borders. The operation demonstrated that Allied forces could make mistakes and that overambitious planning could lead to operational failures. But it also demonstrated that Allied forces could absorb such setbacks without compromising their overall strategic position and could continue offensive operations despite tactical disappointments. Hitler's decision to launch the Ardennes offensive in December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, represented his most ambitious attempt to alter the strategic balance in the West through offensive action that might split Allied forces, capture the port of Antwerp, and create conditions for negotiated settlement with Western allies that would allow Germany to concentrate forces against the Soviets. The operation committed Germany's last operational reserves to offensive that had minimal chance of achieving stated objectives, that was based on assumptions about Allied weaknesses and coordination problems that were not supported by evidence, and that reflected Hitler's continued conviction that bold action and tactical surprise could overcome the material disadvantages that made sustained offensive operations impossible for German forces by late 1944. The planning for the Ardennes offensive revealed Hitler's complete detachment from military realities by late 1944 and his inability to accept what the correlation of forces meant for Germany's prospects. The operation required fuel that Germany did not possess in sufficient quantities, required air support that the Luftwaffe could not provide against Allied air superiority, assumed that weather conditions would prevent Allied air operations during the critical period, and depended on achieving objectives before Allied forces could respond with the kind of rapid reinforcement and counterattack that their superior logistics and reserves enabled. Each of these assumptions was questionable or demonstrably false. Yet Hitler insisted that the operation proceed because he could not accept that Germany lacked the capability for strategic offensive operations, and because he convinced himself that bold action could create the kind of political crisis among the Allies that might lead to negotiated settlement. The Ardennes offensive achieved initial tactical surprise and created crisis for Allied forces that required rapid response and significant adjustments to planned operations, demonstrating that German forces retained tactical competence and that Allied intelligence and defensive preparations were not perfect. But Eisenhower's response to the crisis, shifting forces to contain German penetration, maintaining coherent command structure despite the surprise and despite pressure created by German advances, and organizing counterattacks that progressively reduced the bulge and destroyed German forces that had been committed to the operation, demonstrated exactly the kind of organizational competence and systematic approach that Hitler had insisted American command could not produce. Within weeks, the German offensive had been contained and reversed. The forces committed had been largely destroyed or had retreated, having accomplished nothing except temporary disruption of Allied timetables, and the strategic situation in the West had deteriorated further for Germany as the reserves squandered in the Ardennes were reserves that would not be available for defending against the Soviet offensives preparing to launch in the East. The Battle of the Bulge thus represented final demonstration of the gap between Hitler's strategic thinking and military reality. He had committed Germany's last reserves to operation based on wishful thinking rather than realistic assessment, had achieved tactical surprise, but could not convert it into strategic success, and had further weakened Germany's overall position in pursuit of objectives that were never achievable with available means. The final months of fighting in the West from January through May 1945 saw Allied forces under Eisenhower's coordination crossing the Rhine, advancing through Germany from multiple directions, linking up with Soviet forces advancing from the east, and progressively occupying German territory until organized resistance collapsed and German forces surrendered. Throughout this period, Eisenhower's management of coalition forces demonstrated capabilities that Hitler had insisted were impossible. Allied forces maintained coordination despite operating across vast territories, resolved disputes between American and British commanders about operational priorities without compromising overall strategic coherence, and sustained offensive operations at pace that prevented German forces from establishing effective defensive positions or from conducting the kind of mobile defense that might have delayed Allied advances. The contrast between Eisenhower's command effectiveness and Hitler's progressive detachment from military reality became more pronounced as the war entered its final phase. Eisenhower maintained contact with field commanders, adjusted plans based on actual battlefield conditions, and made decisions grounded in realistic assessment of what forces could accomplish with available resources. Hitler issued orders to phantom armies that no longer existed. insisted that positions be held that had already been overrun, and made strategic decisions based on ideological imperatives rather than on military logic. The gap between these two approaches to command, one based on professional military competence and systematic coordination of coalition forces, the other based on ideological conviction and refusal to accept what battlefield realities demonstrated, was ultimately the gap between victory and defeat, between military system that functioned effectively despite its complexities and military system that had been corrupted by totalitarian politics until professional competence was subordinated to ideological loyalty. When Hitler learned that Eisenhower controlled the Western Front, he was learning something he attempted to dismiss through ideological conviction, but that events would prove decisive. That the United States had produced a commander capable of coordinating coalition forces effectively, of planning and executing complex operations successfully, of managing the diplomatic and military challenges of alliance warfare, and of applying American industrial might and organizational capacity systematically to defeating Germany in the West. Hitler's assessment of Eisenhower as mere staff officer rather than combat commander, his conviction that American forces would be poorly led and would suffer from inevitable coordination problems in coalition operations, and his belief that German tactical superiority could overcome Allied material advantages, all of these judgments were proven catastrophically wrong, as Eisenhower's command achieved D-Day success, liberated France, defeated the Ardennes offensive, and drove into Germany to achieve final victory. The tragedy for Germany was that Hitler's inability to accurately assess Eisenhower's capabilities and what American command of the Western Front would mean was not an isolated misjudgment, but was rather characteristic of the ideologically driven strategic thinking that had led Germany into unwinnable wars and that prevented realistic assessment of enemy capabilities throughout the conflict. The racial theories that taught that mongrel democracies could not produce military excellence, the conviction that will and determination could overcome material disadvantages, the assumption that Allied coalitions would fracture under pressure. Each of these beliefs shaped Hitler's response to Eisenhower's appointment, and each was proven false through the systematic demonstration of Allied capabilities in the Normandy campaign and in the operations that followed. By the time Hitler could no longer deny that Eisenhower's command had achieved what Nazi ideology insisted was impossible, it was far too late to alter the strategic trajectory that was leading to Germany's total defeat and to the complete destruction of the Reich that Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years, but that had led Germany to catastrophe within 12 years of his seizure of power.